Then we will move on to, let's see, some theories. Yes, I'd like to talk about these theories before we jump into how we do PR. Again, I will remind you, this is the part where I throw some stuff at you. These are things you would ideally study more in depth. So, but the reason I'm going to tell you about these is so that you can kind of understand some of the basis of why we do when we're doing it. So these are pretty much three very key media theories. Yes, there's probably, there's a famous photo that you've all probably seen before.
Yeah.
So framing is indeed about taking a little picture frame and putting inside that frame what you want your audiences, your target audiences to see. So in our case, we want to put smiling faces, holding hands. Oh, no. And leave potentially, like Sarah mentioned, or no, Nikita mentioned in yesterday's module, we want to capture smiling faces and not to capture, say, anyone drinking wine. That's not within our frame. But also, framing isn't just about what you visually capture. Framing is about how you are, often in our case, by the way, it's mostly about copywriting and mostly about how we phrase things. So let's say the Media Academy happened. A bunch of us got together and we trained on media and communication skills, right? That's what we did in the most boring sense. When we're putting this on social media, we're unlikely to say, a bunch of us got together on Zoom and we did a training on media. We're going to frame it in the most beautiful, gorgeous, golden gilded frame that we can find. And we're going to say 17 people from 15 different countries in Europe got together over the weekend to discuss the principles of PR relating to the communication efforts of our organization. That's how we want to frame it, and that's how we want to share it with the public. So framing is an important component of how we communicate and how we put things. Then we have agenda setting. Agenda setting is also relatively self-explanatory, and I'm sure you've heard of it before. Yes, Omicron. So for the next week and a half, if not 2 weeks, there will be a news cycle where all we're going to hear about is Omicron. This is not because some big power decided that now we need to talk about Omicron. However, it is actually that a large number of big mainstream media organizations are deciding that currently this is the most important thing, and therefore this is what they're going to talk about. And when they talk about, when mainstream media organizations talk about something for a while, that can be put as agenda setting, in that they are setting the agenda for what the public sphere will be discussing. Of course, it's not only something that mainstream media does. It can be influencers. It can even be 9gag, actually. If 9gag for 2 weeks is talking about cryptocurrencies, you can bet your ass that is on purpose, and they're trying to set an agenda of putting cryptocurrencies in people's minds. Agenda setting is usually done quite purposefully and strategically. And in our case of public relations, how agenda setting applies is you as a communicator always have an agenda. Within public relations, your objective is to get your agenda to be the agenda that your relative publics are talking about. So if you have a international session happening in your hometown, let's see, we have the 98th international session happening in Minsk, which I don't think it is, but let's assume that would be great. In that case, your agenda is to share, let's say one of your agendas is to share with the Belarusian public that there's this amazing international youth events happening. And what you want is for the mainstream media or for influencers or for any of your key media stakeholders to take this as a agenda and to push this forward as something that your relative publics are talking about. Agenda setting is, of course, a much greater theory where we think about and talk about manipulating publics and purposefully, focusing on some agendas over others and so on, but I won't get too much into that. And lastly, before I further bore you to death, we have mediatization and media logic. Mediatization is a perspective to look at the process in which our lives are increasingly becoming more intertwined with media and becoming more interdependent with media. That is not only mainstream media and the news. When you say media, it's pretty much everything from the Zoom we're discussing to the iPad I'm using, to the Discord and Slack and Facebook and your phones and pretty much all of it. So mediatization is just the process of media and our lives becoming increasingly interdependent. The reason this is important to public relations is when you're trying to communicate with your publics, when you're trying to strategically develop a communication strategy, let's say, then you want to think about how mediatized your publics may be. Because, for example, if we're doing a PR campaign in the Netherlands, we may predominantly go through Instagram and maybe TikTok. Whereas if we're doing a media campaign, we're doing a media campaign in, say, Belarus, then in Belarus, we may still want to do Instagram, but we may also want to start looking at some local papers if what we want to do is outreach, right? Then we want to say, well, in these societies, mediatization is at a level where newspapers are still extremely important. So we want to use this as a medium. I actually don't know, by the way, I'm making this up. Apologies if any of it is wrong to Lucas or yours. And media logic is slightly more complicated, but it's essentially to look at things from the perspective of media, to say why a news organization may find what you're proposing to them newsworthy or not. And media logic is often following things like sensationalism. It's following things like agenda setting. They're very much interconnected in that sense. But we don't need to get into this too much. Then we can quickly jump into how do we PR? So we talked about what PR is, why PR is, but how we do it is a slightly more complicated process, which I think the rest of this module is kind of going to focus on. So there's something that Joris mentioned earlier, in that he feels like PR can be so many different things and that it's sometimes confusing. That's because there are very different ways of doing PR. There are different models of doing PR. And these different models just will fit your needs differently at certain points. So whereas you use one model for a certain objective, you may use a different model. And indeed in EYP, because we are an organization that does so many types of communication to so many different audiences, we actually use almost all of these models, or we should. So if you think about who we communicate with, let's say we're all an NC board together, we're a 17-person NC board, we're like the biggest NC board ever, and we are all the PR team of the NC board. This is like a really loaded NC, and I assume we're even getting paid. This is amazing. So what we are going to have as our target audiences, as the people we communicate with, we have two main little, we have two main bubbles, right? We have the EYP bubble and the non-EYP bubble. So you can also think of it as internal and external communication. And we will talk about internal and external communication a little more down the later in the day. But if you think about the relevant audiences we have, internally we have, let's say, the GB and the office. We have our NC, so the NC members. We have our EYPers. And then externally, we will have, I mean, so many, right? So we will have our sponsors, we will have our partners, we will have our outreach, we will have the general public.
Speakers.
We will have speakers. This one will go on, but we are doing a lot of communication in EYP, because if you think about a company, almost and the entire communication efforts of a company are external. They have internal communication happening, but there will be like one guy's quarter portion of a job to do that, whereas like 5-6 people's main job will be external. So it's important to recognize that in EYP, we're actually working with quite a handful of different types of communication and different audiences. So to come back to PR models, sorry, I'm for stalling, there are very different models we can take. The first is a press agent and publicity model. So this is a kind of very basic level of, sorry. Remember when I talked about the history and when I said 19th century, 20th century, well, the press agent publicity is pretty much the first kind of model of PR agent, where they basically want to PR. This is the guy in the Wild West, if you've ever seen one of those movies that has like a bunch of magic hair potions and claims that you're going to gain your hair back if you take these potions, or the ads you get on those shady websites that tell you that if you use this pill, you're going to grow taller or something. It's indeed that the press agent publicity is about persuasion. It's about giving half-truths and manipulation. You'll see this a lot, for example, in like fitness websites, I would say. A lot of them will have those like really clickbaity things where they'll make these really big claims that can't technically be a lie, but it's also not really true. This is that. And their main objective is just to influence the audience, which will then get them their organizational desires. Then we have the public information model. So this is a key model that we will use, that we should use more, which is to do things like press releases and do a lot of one-way communication, where let's say you have that international session in Minsk happening, you definitely want to have a press release from the opening ceremony where you've invited many press members, and you give them a press release and you tell them, yes, this is what the session is about. This is the number of people we have. This is our purpose. This is what we're trying to achieve. And this is essentially aiming for you to give as much information as you can to your key stakeholders and to your key publics, to inform them, which then you hope they will take on and maybe republish, or it will just get you to that level of awareness that you're hoping for. Just keep in mind that this is more about distributing organizational information. This is more about telling these press people what EYP is and what we're doing here. And in this case, what Joris mentioned also becomes relevant, that you may feel like a little journalist. So when you're working within a public information model, it's more likely than not that you're essentially kind of like a little journalist. You're taking photos, you're writing press releases, and you're publishing this. If you think about media teams, I mean, I don't know about media teams now, can't say. So think about media teams almost 3 years ago. That's all I can speak for. You take photos of the event and you publish it on Facebook. And that's also, in a way, a public information model. And in a way, you're basically trying to share as much information about the event as you can for others to pick up. Then we have these two last models are relatively newer and also kind of more cutting edge that we would like to work more with. So the two-way asymmetrical model, which sounds like a mouthful, but it's very simple, where we're looking to engage audiences in that very mutually beneficial relationship I was talking about. This is like a very specific on-the-nose example of it, where you want to have the audiences you're communicating with be encouraged and persuaded to communicate back with you, for them to love what they're seeing so much that they are themselves involved in the communication. So something that obviously came about with the advent of social media, the internet, is that now communication isn't one way. Now we are part of the communication process, right? We are now the newsmakers, the content creators. So this model really looks at that And the best example I can give you of this model actually is the Spotify Wrapped. Spotify Wrapped is one of the most brilliant PR campaigns ever, in my opinion at least, because all they do is train their algorithm to use data to put it in a nice visual way, share it with you, and you love it so much that you are the one sharing it on your Instagram story, and you're involved in their PR campaign. They're not the ones pushing Spotify Wrapped on billboards and on television. They're not, giving you ads on your Instagram so you see this amazing new Spotify Wrapped. They're not doing any of that. They're just giving it to you, and you're becoming a part and process of this campaign. So that's very much a two-way asymmetrical model. But then finally, we have a two-way symmetrical model. And this is very much about, by the way, I'm not discussing research much, but within professional PR, there's always research involved in both of these models. There's actually extensive empirical research to audiences' behaviors before they do any of this, but we don't really need to worry about that. And this is very much a discussion with the public kind of thing. This is a we give you, you give us, and we take action kind of PR campaign. So these are the four PR models. You can utilize all of these in different ways to suit your objectives. One isn't better than the other per se. It's all about what you're trying to achieve. And again, don't worry if you can't recite all of these by heart right now. These are things you can look into more later and research if you're interested. So what I've been saying from the beginning is that PR is all about strategic communication. And this is where we kind of get more into the depths of how we really practically step-by-step do strategic communication. How do we make a plan and act on that plan? And this is actually, if there's anyone who initially joined with the EYP media track and is like, why am I sitting here listening to all these NC examples? The reason we have this module for everyone is because if you're ever editing an international session, you are asked to create a communication strategy. So there you are thinking about strategic communication of that event from the media team perspective. If you're working on a event as a PR communication person, from the very beginning of the project, you should be thinking about what's the communication strategy of this event? What is our strategy from pre-session, session to post-session to communicate with our relevant publics, to engage our relevant publics in the messages that we're trying to push. So it's really kind of the fundamentals at every step of what you should be thinking about and how you should be approaching doing your role as a PR communication, whatever the name of the role is specifically. And it all starts with planning. What do we have here? Oh, yes. This is a bit of a template on how we do planning for strategic communication. And this is very loose. We'll get into this, like the specifics of each of these. But to kind of think about it in a very general sense of, I will do this, 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 and this, we can think about it as a problem. So what is the problem? We've kind of done this in committee work before as well. So in our case, the problem is that we're doing a youth event and people may not really care about youth events. So we want to ensure that our communication strategy is tackling the issue that what we're doing isn't necessarily newsworthy, and what we're doing isn't necessarily something people are waiting to write headlines about or waiting in line to come and join an EYP session. The problem is that we're a youth organization doing very cool stuff that is very difficult to communicate to people who aren't doing the cool stuff. That's usually the biggest problem in EYP. You may have more specific problems in your NCs, by the way, or you may have issues that people, for example, may not be able to reach you through the communication channels you have. So there may be different nuances to your problem, but I would say that in EYP, the most fundamental problem you're always going to be tackling is the fact that we're doing cool stuff and it's hard to communicate these cool stuff. And then we want to think about what we want to achieve. So what our goals are and what our objectives are. We're doing an international session and we want to communicate this. Cool. So what do we want to achieve? Our goals shouldn't be, we want everyone to know about our IS, but rather we want to let's say one of our goals can be, we want to be engaging with local media, right? So I think local has been a big thing at EYP events recently. We want to engage with local communities, and let's say that's one of our goals, that we want to engage within the local community that we're in. Cool. So some of our objectives can be to get an interview on the local newspaper. It can be to have a join a radio show, like a local radio show, or it can be to go out there into the street and actually talk to some people, have people come into our GA, for example. That can be how we, or what we want to achieve. Then we want to think about who needs to be communicated with. So if we're engaging our local businesses, let's say, I think there were some events that happened before the pandemic that were all about like engaging local businesses and working with them at the session. It may have been a PowerShift project. And then we want to think about what our target groups are and what our stakeholders are. So if we're engaging with the locals, it's obviously small, medium enterprises in the area, but it can also be, let's say, middle-aged people in the area, right? That would very much be our target group. And you should kind of think about your demographics when you're thinking about target groups, especially if you're an NC member and you're doing outreach, for example, and you're thinking about target groups. It's not really just 16-year-olds in your area, right? You want to kind of narrow down the demographics a bit and really think about, let's say in this town, we want to engage with like high schools that are, I don't know the word in English, like you have vocational high schools and theoretical high schools. I don't know the term. So you may want to engage with like the latter. I don't know. The difference between target groups and stakeholders, I think is very clear, but essentially that your target groups are the people you're trying to engage and have them join you in your session maybe, or know about your session, whereas your stakeholders are maybe going to be the local businesses that you want to sponsor you, right? You may want to not only let local businesses know about your event, but you may want them to give you some of their products to hand out in the welcome bags. In that case, they become stakeholders. The difference being that stakeholder doesn't have to be a sponsor. It can also be maybe local businessman that you want to come as a speaker. That can be a stakeholder. Maybe you have a topic that's discussing climate change. Then you want the local weather guy to come and be an expert. That would be a stakeholder. But you want to think about your audiences and who you should be communicating with. So then what we want to think about, what we should say, what our content should be. I feel like this is actually a bit of a step that we skip sometimes in EYP, and at least I can recall as a IS organizer working on communication that this was a step that we kind of didn't think about as much, because content to us can easily just be a little Canva template with the EYP logo on, some smiling faces, and we think that if we put this on Instagram, it'll be engaging our audiences. But we perhaps want to think about what we should say more strategically, right? We want to think about, to go back to framing, we want to think about how we want to frame our message, and how we want to set the agenda through the way we frame our message. So what we need to say to these different stakeholders and to the different audiences should be tailored to the best way that they'll engage with it. Let's say if we're engaging middle-aged local businesses, or no, local businesses run by middle-aged people, rather. In that case, you want what you say to very much be framed with middle-aged people's way of looking at things, right? You're probably not gonna use a lot of hashtags, you know, hashtag Young Europe, hashtag cool, or you're probably not gonna use a lot of lingo, but you're maybe going to orient it in a way that's going to draw their attention more by saying, here's young people interested in, what's your business? Dry cleaning. Here's a lot of young people with suits interested in dry cleaning. But you can also think about doing outreach, for example. You want new delegates, you want new demographics in your NC, you want to kind of open your range of delegates. Then you want, when you're engaging these people, you can specifically think about using words like, let's say like travel Europe and meet new people, different cultures, right? These are things that may interest people who aren't doing EYP, who may get intrigued by the idea of meeting new people from different cultures and traveling. So that would go in what you should say to engage those stakeholders. How we should say it to reach them is a little different in that the way you frame it really matters, but also the way you the communication channels you use to engage them matters in this case. Now, this is the part that never happens in EYP, even in the best PR practices. This just never ever happens. So this is just something I want to stress. If anyone ever is inspired enough to put in the work, this is a difficult and lengthy process to do, especially if you're a volunteer, I think. But it's also very important. So how can our success be measured? This is something you do in the beginning of your process, where you create a criteria. And I'm not going to delve too deep into this because it's quite a bit, but you basically want to create a criteria of success to say, as simple, it can be bullet list as well, to say, if we do this, we succeed. If we do this, we succeed. If we do this, we succeed. So this can be, if we can get the local businessman as a speaker, we succeed. Or it can be, if we manage to, so I had a goal as a editor of regionals, Czech regionals actually, yes, where my goal was, if we're able to reach 10,000 people with our Facebook page, that indicates success. Another was, if we managed to get 2,000 views on this video, that's a success. If we manage to, let's say, engage people from at least 45 countries, that's a success. So our success criteria we set in the very beginning, and then we think about it at the end of our campaign and throughout our campaign. We think about, okay, this is what we're communicating, this is how we're framing it, this is how we're sending it off. Then we wait, we see, you can look at Facebook Insights, Instagram Insights, or you can just, it depends on your criteria really. Then we think about, okay, are we achieving our goals? Are we successful in our communication? If we're not, then how can we adjust our approach to meet our criteria? We usually don't have time for this, or we don't dedicate the time for this in UIP, but I think it can be really useful, even if on a very basic level, when you're making your strategy, you kind of get these criteria for yourself. Then you can also keep a check on how well you're doing. Say you're an NC communication person, you start your term, you have 1 year to achieve everything and be amazing. What the first thing you look at is what's happening now. You analyze your situation. What's the status quo of our communication efforts? What's our NC doing? Of course, this is a lengthy analysis process that I don't think I will go into breaking down now, but in the most rudimentary level, what you can do is scan all the social media of your NC. What do we do on Facebook? What do we do on Instagram? What do we do with our newsletter? That's internal, but sure. Look at, okay, is this sufficient? Is this getting engagement? Is this reaching our goals? And then perhaps look at what are we not doing, or what can we be doing better? And that kind of brings us to what should we do and why we should do it. So why is a key little term here for sure. Well, why am I not drawing? Yes. Because oftentimes, not oftentimes, but sometimes we don't think about why we're doing something as much as just doing it. So maybe when you think about, okay, so we're going to, as an NC, we're going to do these series where we just talk to alumni from our NC, and we publish posts about their success, right? Sounds great, cool. But then why are we doing it? Like, what's the purpose in us doing it? What PR objectives is that? To think about how your communication is going to get you to reach your goals. And then you want to think about implementing it. So if you think about the Are We Europe module yesterday, if you were there, they talked about the design thinking process, where you think about inspiration, ideation, iteration, and implementation. This is a very similar cycle. If you think about, first having some ideas, thinking about what's happening, or rather getting inspired by thinking, okay, this is what's happening, so what should we do? Then you get some ideas on what specifically you should do, and then you implement those ideas. So how should we do it? How should we say it? How do we communicate it? And then you go to evaluate it. So that's what I was talking about previously with the planning, that you should most certainly evaluate how you did at the end of it. So for example, if yours is a NC board member now, I don't know if you are, but I'll assume you are.
I am.
At the end of yours term, something that he can do before passing it on to the next year's term, next year's board members, is giving them a little report, an assessment of how EYP Netherlands did this year, what their key objectives were, how they feel they met that, what they did. So then next year, when Anka magically becomes EYP Netherlands board member, you come, apologies, you come and you say, so yours didn't do this right, but I'm going to do this better than him. then Anka comes and fixes the shortcomings, or Anka says, oh, look, yours did this really cool thing with EYP Netherlands alumni. I'm going to make sure that we continue this. So that's a little gap in that we sometimes have, that we miss. Maybe there's something good happening, but it doesn't continue because obviously our board, most boards change every year, and the next board just maybe is lost or just doesn't know that this happened, and they need to prolong something. So it's a good idea to leave assessments and evaluations for the next term, and this will, I think, most certainly improve things in the long term as well. Some alternative ways of planning and looking at this are this model called RACE. So this is research, action, communication, evaluation. Not too much in our case, because we don't do too much research, but we could very much do research in thinking, our relevant audiences are this and this, or maybe saying we're trying to do outreach, but it's not working. Maybe let's do some research as to what kind of young people in our communities, in our country would be interested. Let's try to research how maybe you're trying to do outreach into minority groups in your country, right? So maybe you want to do research. Okay, which areas in our country are there more minority groups, or which areas in our city are there more minority groups? And then think about how can we better communicate with these minority groups. So some research will definitely be useful. Then you take action into creating a strategy, creating a framework, you communicate with them, and then you evaluate your communication. We use multiple tools to do this. This is the part that you will all know the most, I think, because we often use a lot of these in EYP. So a SWOT analysis you will use to evaluate the communication goals that you have, or the strategy that you have. So you can think about the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities and threats that you have with your plan right now. So it's a risk analysis tool, but also to evaluate how good your plan is, essentially. And you can do this with yourself, or you can do it within the board. You can ask the rest of the board members, the rest of the organizing team to do this with you, where you show them your plan, and they can say, okay, well, these are the strengths, but maybe there are some weaknesses in this, and then you can adjust your strategy accordingly. Pestle, we use Pestle all the time in EYP in committee work, I'm sure you know. But it is political, economic, social, technological. I always forget the other, environmental and legal. So you can think about these as different aspects you're trying to cover, and different kind of bases of your strategy. A communication audit is very much what I was talking about with the evaluation. So an audit is when you look at the efforts of the NC, let's say, so far, and say, okay, so this is working, this didn't work so far, and so on. We don't really do policy analysis, but I just put it in there in case. And these are just essentially some tools you can use to better strategize your communication plan. And that, I believe, is principles of PR on my side.